The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province, as Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez adjusted her tactical gear one final time. The 28-year-old explosive ordnance disposal specialist had been deployed with SEAL Team 6 for 8 months, but today felt different. Something in the air seemed heavier, more electric with tension than usual. Maria had grown up in a small Texas town where her father worked construction and her mother cleaned houses. Nobody in her family had ever served in the military, alone specialized in defusing bombs. But Maria had always been drawn to puzzles, to problems that others found impossible to solve. As a child, she would spend hours taking apart old radios and clocks, figuring out how each piece worked together. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence suggested that a high-value Taliban commander was hiding in a compound about 15 kilometers northeast of their forward operating base. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by hills, making it a natural fortress but also a potential trap. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the team leader, had emphasized the importance of speed and stealth. "We go in fast, we get our target, and we get out," Morrison had said, his weathered face serious in the dim light of the briefing tent. Intel suggests minimal resistance, but we all know how reliable that can be. Maria had nodded along with the other 11 team members. She carried specialized equipment that could detect and neutralize improvised explosive devices, but she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. The team preferred clean operations where her skills weren't required. The helicopter ride to the insertion point had been routine. Maria sat between Petty Officer First Class Danny Chen, a sniper whose steady hands had saved their lives more times than she could count, and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams, a demolitions expert who shared her love of understanding how things worked. The familiar weight of her gear and the rhythmic thrum of the rotors had actually been comforting. They had inserted without incident in the pre-dawn darkness, hiking through rough terrain for 3 hours to reach their observation point. The EE compound lay before them exactly as described in their intelligence briefings. A rectangular building made of mud bricks, surrounded by a low wall, with what appeared to be minimal security. Morrison used hand signals to direct the team into position. Maria found herself assigned to the rear guard with Williams and 2 other SEALs, ready to provide overwatch and technical support if needed. The plan called for the main assault team to breach the compound while her group secured their escape route and watched for enemy reinforcements. Everything went perfectly for the first 20 minutes. The assault team moved like shadows, reaching the compound walls without detection. Maria watched through her night vision goggles as they prepared to breach the main entrance. Her heart rate stayed steady, controlled by years of training and dozens of similar operations. The explosion came without warning. A massive blast erupted from the compound, sending chunks of mud brick and debris flying through the air. The shockwave hit Maria's position seconds later, and she instinctively pressed herself against the rocky outcropping that provided their cover. Her ears rang from the noise, but her training kicked in immediately. "IED at the breach point," Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, strained but controlled. "Multiple casualties. We need immediate extraction." Maria's mind raced as she processed the information. An improvised explosive device at the breach meant this was a trap. The Taliban commander had probably been long gone, leaving behind a deadly surprise for anyone who came looking. The question now was whether there were more explosives waiting. "Gonzalez, we need you up here." Morrison's voice came again. "The whole front of the building is compromised, and we have wounded who can't move." Maria grabbed her equipment pack and started moving toward the compound. Williams caught her arm as she passed. "Careful, Maria," he said quietly. "If they put one bomb there, they probably put more." She nodded, understanding the implication. The blast at the breach point might have been just the beginning. Anyone trying to rescue the wounded SEALs could trigger additional devices. It was a common Taliban tactic: wound the enemy with the first explosion, then kill the rescuers with the second. As Maria moved carefully through the darkness toward the compound, she could see the devastation the explosion had caused. The front wall was completely destroyed, and smoke still rose from the rubble. She could hear voices calling out, some in pain, others trying to coordinate their response to the crisis. Her equipment pack felt heavier with each step. Inside were the tools that could mean the difference between life and death for her teammates. Metal detectors, probes, wire cutters, and the steady nerves needed to use them all effectively. She had trained for scenarios like this, but training never fully prepared someone for the weight of real lives hanging in the balance. Morrison's voice came over the radio again, and this time she could hear the urgency beneath his professional, calm. "We have 3 wounded, 1 critical. The building is unstable and we need to move them. But the whole area could be rigged." Maria reached the edge of what had been the compound wall and peered through her night vision at the scene beyond. Several of her teammates were pinned down behind chunks of debris, unable to move without exposing themselves to potential secondary explosions. The wounded were calling out, their voices weak but persistent. She took a deep breath and keyed her radio. "This is Gonzalez. I'm going to sweep the area and find us a safe path out." What she didn't say was what everyone already knew. That meant she would have to go first into the potentially explosive area, testing each step to ensure it was safe for the others to follow. One wrong step, one missed wire or pressure plate, and she would join the wounded or worse. Maria checked her equipment one final time and said a silent prayer to whatever forces might be listening. Then she took her first step into the compound, beginning what would become the longest and most dangerous walk of her life. Maria's first step onto the compound ground sent a chill through her entire body. The ground beneath her boot felt different somehow, softer than it should be. Years of training had taught her to trust these subtle sensations, and right now, every instinct was screaming danger. She froze in place, not daring to shift her weight. Through her night vision goggles, she could see her trapped teammates about 30 meters ahead. Petty Officer Rodriguez was lying motionless near the destroyed wall, while Chief Martinez was applying pressure to a wound on Seaman Thompson's leg. They were all watching her, understanding that their lives now depended on her ability to detect and avoid the explosive devices that were almost certainly hidden around them. Maria slowly reached into her pack and withdrew her handheld metal detector. The device was about the size of a small flashlight, but infinitely more sophisticated. It could detect metal objects buried up to 18 inches underground and was sensitive enough to find a single coin in a sandbox. More importantly for her current situation, it could identify the metallic components that made up most improvised explosive devices. She swept the detector in a slow arc around her feet, listening for the telltale beeping that would indicate buried metal. The device remained silent. Either there was nothing metallic nearby, or the explosives were made entirely from non-metallic materials like plastic and chemical compounds. Both possibilities were equally terrifying for different reasons. "Talk to me, Gonzalez." Morrison's voice came through her earpiece. "What are you seeing?" Maria kept her voice steady as she responded. "No metal signatures in my immediate area, but that doesn't mean it's clear. Could be plastic explosives with minimal metal components." She knew that the most dangerous improvised explosive devices often used very little metal, making them nearly impossible to detect with standard equipment. The Taliban had learned to make bombs using plastic containers, chemical fertilizers, and pressure plates made from wood or plastic. These devices could be just as deadly as their metallic counterparts, but were much harder to find. Maria took another step forward, this time probing the ground ahead with a long metal rod before placing her full weight down. The rod met firm resistance, suggesting solid ground, but she knew that meant nothing. Some pressure plates were designed to support a certain amount of weight before triggering, allowing someone to test the ground safely but exploding when a full human body stepped on them. Behind her, she could hear Williams coordinating with the helicopter pilots to establish an extraction zone. The problem was that any landing zone would need to be cleared of explosives first, and the only person qualified to do that job was currently creeping through what might be a minefield. "Maria," came Martinez's voice, weak but urgent. "Rodriguez isn't responding. We need to get him out of here fast." She looked toward her injured teammates and felt her heart sink. Rodriguez was one of the youngest members of their unit, barely 22 years old. He had joined the Navy straight out of high school in Ohio, driven by a desire to serve his country and see the world. His parents had been terrified when he told them he wanted to be a SEAL, but they had supported him anyway. Maria took another step, then another. Each movement was calculated and deliberate, She would probe ahead with her rod, sweep the area with her detector, then carefully place her foot down while distributing her weight as evenly as possible. The process was agonizingly slow, but rushing would get everyone killed. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cool night air. The psychological pressure was almost unbearable. She knew that somewhere beneath her feet or around her teammates, explosive devices were waiting for the slightest trigger to detonate. The Taliban were experts at psychological warfare, and forcing rescue teams to navigate through minefields was one of their favorite tactics. "Contact left," came Chen's voice from the overwatch position. "Vehicle approaching from the valley road." Maria's blood ran cold. If enemy forces were approaching, her teammates would need to move immediately. Explosive devices or not, they couldn't afford to wait for her to slowly clear every step of the path to their position. Morrison's voice came over the radio, calm but commanding. "How long do we have, Chen?" "Vehicle is moving slowly, maybe 5 minutes out. Could be civilian, but we can't take that chance." Maria realized she had to make a decision that could save or doom them all. She could continue her slow, methodical approach, which was the safest method but would take too long. Or she could trust her instincts and training to move faster, accepting greater risk but potentially saving everyone from the approaching threat. She looked at her wounded teammates again. Rodriguez still hadn't moved, and his stillness was becoming more ominous with each passing second. Martinez was struggling to keep pressure on Thompson's wound while also trying to maintain security. They needed help immediately, not in 10 or 15 minutes. "I'm going to move faster," she announced over the radio. "Williams, start prepping the wounded for immediate extraction." Maria increased her pace, still probing ahead but taking larger steps and spending less time at each potential danger point. Her detector remained mostly quiet, picking up only a few small metal fragments that were probably debris from the initial explosion. She was halfway to her teammates when the detector began beeping steadily. Something metallic was buried directly in her path, something large enough and close enough to the surface to trigger a strong signal. Maria dropped to one knee and began carefully clearing away loose dirt and debris from the area where the detector indicated buried metal. What she found made her stomach drop. A thin wire, barely visible in the darkness, stretched across the path at ankle height. Following the wire with her eyes, she could see it led to a disturbed area of ground about 3 feet away, where something was clearly buried. The setup was simple but deadly. Anyone walking along this path would catch the wire with their foot, triggering whatever explosive device was connected to it. "Tripwire," she reported quietly. "I need a few minutes to disarm it." The problem was that she didn't have a few minutes. The approaching vehicle was getting closer, and Rodriguez needed medical attention immediately. Maria had to make another, impossible choice: try to quickly disarm the device or find another way around it. She chose a third option that made her hands shake with fear, even as she prepared to execute it. Maria pulled out her wire cutters with hands that trembled slightly despite years of training. She had disarmed dozens of improvised explosive devices before, but never under these conditions. Never with wounded teammates bleeding out nearby, and enemy forces approaching their position. The tripwire stretched taut across her path, almost invisible in the darkness. She knew that cutting the wrong wire or disturbing the device in any way could trigger an explosion that would kill not only her but potentially everyone in the area. Some bombs were designed with anti-tampering mechanisms that would detonate if someone tried to disarm them. She traced the wire carefully with her flashlight, following its path to the buried device. The setup looked relatively simple, which could be either reassuring or terrifying. Simple devices were sometimes easier to disarm, but they could also be designed to explode at the slightest disturbance. "Vehicle is 3 minutes out," Chen reported from his overwatch position. "Definitely. Military looks like a Taliban patrol." Morrison's voice came through her earpiece, tight with controlled urgency. "Gonzalez, we're out of time. Can you clear this thing?" Maria studied the wire and the disturbed ground where the explosive device was buried. In a perfect world, she would spend 20 minutes carefully excavating the area, identifying every component of the bomb, and then methodically disabling each part. But they didn't live in a perfect world. I can try to cut the wire, but there's no guarantee it won't. Have a backup trigger, she said quietly. Or I can try to go around it. Going around meant leaving the established path and moving into completely unknown territory. There could be additional devices planted in patterns designed to channel people toward specific kill zones. The Taliban were masters at creating complex explosive traps that use the natural human tendency to avoid obvious dangers. Rodriguez groaned weakly from his position near the destroyed wall, and Maria made her decision. She couldn't spend any more time analyzing the situation. Her teammate needed help, and every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death. Maria carefully positioned her wire cutters on the tripwire, took a deep breath, and squeezed. The thin metal strand separated with a tiny snapping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. She held her breath, waiting for an explosion that never came. The device remained silent and motionless. "Wire is cut," she reported, relief flooding through her voice. "Path should be clear to this point." She resumed her advance toward her teammates, moving more quickly now, but still probing ahead with her rod. The metal detector remained mostly quiet except for occasional beeps from small debris fragments scattered by the initial explosion. Maria reached Martinez and Thompson first. The wounded SEAL was conscious but pale, and the makeshift bandage around his leg was soaked with blood. Martinez looked up at her with eyes that reflected both relief and urgency. "Rodriguez hasn't moved in the last few minutes," Martinez said quietly. "I think he might have internal injuries from the blast." Maria moved carefully toward the unconscious SEAL, sweeping the ground ahead of her with both the detector and her probe. Rodriguez lay motionless about 10 feet away, close enough that she could see the rise and fall of his chest, but far enough that reaching him would require crossing potentially dangerous ground. 2 minutes. Chen's voice crackled over the radio. The approaching enemy patrol was running out of time for all of them. Maria abandoned her careful approach and moved quickly toward Rodriguez, trusting her instincts and training to guide her steps. The metal detector remained silent, and her probe found solid ground with each step. She reached the injured SEAL and immediately began checking his vital signs. Rodriguez was alive but unconscious, with a weak pulse and shallow breathing. She could see blood seeping from his ears, which suggested a serious head injury from the explosion's concussion. He needed immediate medical attention that she couldn't provide in the field. "He's alive but critical," she reported. "We need to get him to the extraction zone immediately." The problem was that the extraction zone was back the way she had come, and carrying an unconscious man through a potential minefield was exponentially more dangerous than walking through it alone. Every step would now carry the weight of 2 people instead of 1, potentially triggering devices that might have been stable under her lighter footprint. Morrison's voice came through her earpiece with a new urgency. "Gonzalez, can you mark a safe path for the rest of us to follow?" Maria looked back at the route she had taken to reach her teammates. She had been focused on detecting explosive devices, but she hadn't been marking her exact steps for others to follow. The path existed in her memory, but transferring that knowledge to her teammates in the darkness would be nearly impossible. "I can try to guide you verbally," she said, "but we're going to have to move fast." She grabbed Rodriguez under his arms and began dragging him back toward the compound entrance. His dead weight made every step more difficult, and she had to stop frequently to check the ground ahead. The metal detector was useless now since she needed both hands to move the injured SEAL. Martinez and Thompson followed behind her, with Martinez supporting most of Thompson's weight. The wounded SEAL was gritting his teeth against the pain but keeping pace with their slow retreat from the compound. "Contact!" Chen's voice exploded over the radio. "Vehicle has stopped at the valley entrance. Multiple armed personnel dismounting." Maria felt her heart rate spike as adrenaline flooded her system. The Taliban patrol had arrived, and they were now trapped between potential explosive devices and enemy fighters. The situation had gone from dangerous to nearly impossible. Williams's voice came through the radio from their rear guard position. "I count at least 6 tangos moving up the hillside toward our position. They'll have visual contact in less than 2 minutes. Maria realized they were caught in a perfect trap. The Taliban had used the compound as bait, rigged it with explosives to wound or kill anyone who entered, and then positioned a patrol to finish off any survivors. It was a textbook example of tactical thinking, and it was about to get them all killed. She continued dragging Rodriguez toward the compound entrance, but she knew they wouldn't make it in time. The approaching enemy patrol would reach their position before she could clear a safe path for everyone to escape through the potential minefield. That's when Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of the mission and possibly save all their lives. Change of plan. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter with absolute authority. We're not going back through the minefield. Gonzalez, can you clear a path to the north wall of the compound? Maria looked in the direction Morrison indicated. The north wall was about 20 meters away, but it would require crossing completely unexplored ground. Everything between her current position and that wall could be rigged with explosives. However, it was also their only chance of avoiding the approaching Taliban patrol. I can try, she replied, already shifting Rodriguez's weight to prepare for the new route. But it's going to be slow going. We don't have slow, Morrison responded grimly. Taliban patrol is moving fast up the hillside. Chen, how long before? They have visual on our position? 90 seconds, maybe less, came the sniper's reply from his overwatch position. Maria felt the weight of impossible decisions crushing down on her. Moving quickly meant risking everyone's lives on explosive devices. Moving slowly meant certain contact with enemy forces. Either choice could result in the death of her entire team. She made a decision that went against every piece of training she had ever received. Instead of probing carefully ahead with her rod and metal detector, she would trust her experience and intuition to guide them through the dangerous ground. It was a calculated gamble, with stakes she didn't want to think about. Martinez, take Rodriguez, she said, transferring the unconscious SEAL's weight to his teammate. I need my hands free to work. Maria grabbed her metal detector and began moving toward the north wall at a pace that would have terrified her instructors back in training. She swept the detector in quick arcs ahead of her, listening for the distinctive beeping that would indicate buried metal. When the device remained silent, she took 2 quick steps forward and repeated the process. Behind her, Martinez struggled with Rodriguez's dead weight, while Thompson hobbled along on his injured leg. The small group moved like a wounded animal across the dangerous ground, driven by desperation and the approaching sound of enemy voices carried on the night wind. Contact in sight, Chen reported tensely. 6 armed Taliban moving up the eastern approach. They'll have visual on the compound in 30 seconds. Maria increased her pace even more, accepting risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The metal detector remained mostly quiet, picking up only occasional debris from the initial explosion. Either this section of the compound hadn't been rigged with explosives, or the devices were made from materials her equipment couldn't detect. She reached the north wall without incident, but the real test was still ahead. The wall itself was about 4 feet high and looked climbable, but what lay beyond it was completely unknown. The Taliban could have rigged the far side with additional explosive devices, or positioned fighters to ambush anyone trying to escape in that direction. Wall is clear on this side, she reported quietly. No sign of wires or disturbed ground. Morrison appeared beside her, having followed her exact path across the dangerous terrain. His face was grim, but determined, and she could see the weight of command in his eyes. Every decision he made could mean life or death for his team. Williams, bring up the rear and cover our exit, Morrison ordered. Chen, maintain overwatch and report enemy positions. Maria boosted herself up onto the wall and peered over the far side. The ground beyond sloped away toward a dry riverbed that wound through the valley. The area looked clear, but appearances meant nothing in a combat zone where enemies specialized in creating deadly traps for unwary soldiers. I'm going over, she announced, dropping down onto the far side of the wall. The ground felt solid under her feet, and a quick sweep with her metal detector revealed no buried metallic objects. Appears clear, but I need to check the route to the riverbed. Martinez and Thompson reached the wall next, with Rodriguez's unconscious form draped between them. Getting the wounded SEAL over the 4-foot barrier was going to be difficult and time-consuming, but they had no other choice. Enemy patrol has reached the compound, Chen's voice carried new urgency. They're beginning to sweep the area where you were positioned. Maria felt a chill as she realized how close they had come to disaster. If they had tried to retreat through the minefield as originally planned, they would have been caught in the open by the Taliban patrol. Morrison's decision to change their escape route had probably saved all their lives. She continued sweeping the ground toward the riverbed, moving as quickly as she dared. The metal detector remained quiet, and her visual inspection revealed no obvious signs of disturbed earth or hidden wires. Either this area was genuinely clear, or the Taliban had been more sophisticated in their trap setting than she had anticipated. "Path to the riverbed looks clear," she reported, "but I recommend we move in single file along the exact route I've swept." Morrison and the others had managed to get Rodriguez over the wall, though the process had taken precious minutes they couldn't spare. The unconscious SEAL was breathing but showed no signs of regaining consciousness. His injuries were severe enough that he needed immediate medical evacuation. "Taliban patrol is inside the compound," Chen reported from his overwatch position. "They're examining the blast site and looking for blood trails." Maria realized that their escape had left evidence behind. Blood from Thompson's leg wound and drag marks from moving Rodriguez would tell the enemy patrol exactly which direction they had gone. It was only a matter of time before the Taliban fighters followed their trail to the north wall. "Chen, we need you to relocate and rejoin us," Morrison ordered. "They'll figure out our escape route soon enough." The sniper acknowledged the order, but Maria knew it would take him several minutes to safely leave his overwatch position and reach their location. Minutes they might not have if the Taliban patrol moved quickly to follow their trail. She reached the dry riverbed and found what she had been hoping for: a natural corridor that would provide both concealment and a clear path toward their extraction point. The riverbed wound through the valley for several kilometers before reaching the area where their helicopter could safely land. "Riverbed is clear," she reported. "Natural concealment and a direct route to the extraction zone." As her teammates joined her in the dry creek bed, Maria allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They had successfully escaped the compound and its deadly traps, avoided direct contact with the enemy patrol, and found a route that would take them to safety. But their ordeal was far from over, and the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. The dry riverbed provided excellent concealment, but it also created new dangers that Maria hadn't anticipated. The sandy bottom was soft and unstable, making it difficult to carry Rodriguez while maintaining the quick pace their situation demanded. Worse, the steep banks on either side created a natural funnel that could become a death trap if the Taliban patrol managed to get ahead of them. Maria led the group along the riverbed, still sweeping periodically with her metal detector even, though the likelihood of explosive devices in this natural terrain was much lower. Behind her, Martinez and Williams took turns carrying Rodriguez, whose condition seemed to be deteriorating with each passing minute. Thompson hobbled along on his wounded leg, refusing offers of assistance despite the obvious pain he was experiencing. "Chen, what's your status?" Morrison asked over the radio as they moved through the winding creek bed. "Still moving to your position," came the sniper's reply. "Taliban patrol found your blood trail at the north wall. They're organizing to follow your route." Maria felt her stomach tighten. The enemy fighters had discovered their escape path much faster than she had hoped. Professional soldiers like the Taliban fighters they were dealing with knew how to track wounded prey, and they would move quickly to cut off any escape routes. The riverbed curved sharply to the left ahead, and Maria slowed her pace as she approached the blind corner. In her experience, ambushes were most effective at natural choke points like creek bends, where fleeing enemies would be forced to expose themselves to concentrated fire. She held up her hand to halt the group and crept carefully toward the bend. Using her night vision goggles, she peered around the rocky outcropping that blocked their view of the next section of creek bed. What she saw made her blood run cold. 3 Taliban fighters were positioned along the far bank of the riverbed, about 200 meters ahead. They were well concealed among the rocks and scrub brush, but she could see the distinctive outline of their weapons and equipment. The fighters had somehow gotten ahead of them and were waiting in perfect ambush positions. Maria crept back to where Morrison waited with the rest of the team. 3 hostiles in ambush positions around the next bend, she whispered. "They're dug in good and have overlapping fields of fire." Morrison studied their situation with the calm, analytical approach that had kept his team alive through dozens of dangerous missions. They were trapped in the riverbed with wounded team members, enemy fighters ahead of them, and a Taliban patrol following behind. The tactical situation was nearly hopeless. "Can we go around them?" he asked quietly. Maria shook her head. "The banks are too steep and exposed. We'd be silhouetted against the sky. Easy targets for anyone with decent shooting skills." Williams joined their whispered conference, his demolitions expertise adding another perspective to their tactical problem. "What about going back and finding another route?" "Taliban patrol is maybe 10 minutes behind us," Morrison replied. "We don't have time to backtrack and find a new way out." Rodriguez groaned softly from his position on the ground, the first sound he had made since the initial explosion. Martinez knelt beside him, checking his pulse and breathing. The injured SEAL's condition was clearly getting worse, and he needed medical attention that none of them could provide in the field. "His pulse is getting weaker," Martinez reported, grimly. "We need to get him to the extraction point fast." Maria studied the tactical situation from every angle she could think of. The ambush ahead was perfectly positioned to prevent their escape, but the Taliban fighters had one potential weakness. They were focused on the riverbed itself, expecting their targets to come straight down the creek toward their position. "What, if we don't go through the riverbed?" she asked Morrison. "What if we go over it?" Morrison looked at her with confusion. "The banks are too steep and exposed. You said so yourself." "Not over the banks," Maria clarified, pointing upward. "Over the creek bed itself. There's a narrow ledge about 15 feet up on the north side. If we could get up there, we might be able to move past the ambush without being seen." Williams studied the rocky outcropping she was indicating. The ledge was barely wide enough for one person, and reaching it would require climbing up a nearly vertical rock face. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging but manageable climb. For trained SEALs, with wounded team members and enemy fighters closing in from two directions, it seemed impossible. "How do we get Rodriguez up there?" Martinez asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Maria had been considering the same problem. Rodriguez was unconscious and dead weight, making it nearly impossible for one person to carry him up a rock face. But she had an idea that might work, though it would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. "We use a pulley system," she said, already digging into her equipment pack for the climbing gear that all SEALs carried on missions. "One person goes up first and sets an anchor point. We rig a harness system to haul Rodriguez up while the rest of us climb." Morrison nodded slowly. The plan was dangerous and complex, but it was better than trying to fight through a well-positioned ambush with wounded team members. "How long will it take?" 15 minutes if everything goes perfectly," Maria replied honestly. "Maybe 20 if we run into problems." "Taliban patrol will catch up to us before then," Williams pointed out grimly. Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of their mission. "Chen, we need you to delay that patrol. How much time can you buy us?" The sniper's voice came through their earpieces with professional calm. "I can slow them down but not stop them. Maybe 15 minutes if I'm lucky." "Do it," Morrison ordered. Then he turned to Maria. "You're our climbing expert. Get us up that rock face." Maria looked up at the narrow ledge that represented their only hope of escape. The climb itself wasn't technically difficult, but doing it silently while enemy fighters waited in ambush just 200 meters away would require skills she had never been tested on. She began unpacking her climbing gear, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her team lived or died in this remote valley in Afghanistan. Everything depended on her ability to find a path where none seemed to exist, just as she had done with the minefield at the compound. The only difference was that this time, failure wouldn't just mean her own death, but the deaths of everyone she had sworn to protect. Maria's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she sorted through her climbing equipment in the darkness. Every piece of gear had its place and purpose, and she had memorized their locations through countless training exercises. Now, with enemy fighters closing in from two directions, that training would mean the difference between life and death for her entire team. She selected a lightweight climbing rope, several pythons for anchoring, and a mechanical pulley system designed for rescue operations. The equipment was compact but strong enough to support the weight of a fully equipped SEAL, even an unconscious one like Rodriguez. Chen's engaged, Morrison reported quietly as the distant crack of sniper fire echoed through the valley. That should slow down the patrol, but not for long. Maria began her climb up the rock face, moving as quietly as possible while still maintaining speed. The stone was solid limestone, scarred by years of flash floods and erosion, providing good handholds for someone who knew how to find them. Each movement was calculated and controlled, designed to minimize noise that might alert the ambush team waiting downstream. 15 feet had never seemed so far. Every foot of vertical distance gained was earned through careful placement of hands and feet, testing each hold before committing her full weight. The equipment pack on her back threw off her center of gravity, making the climb more difficult than it would have been under training conditions. She reached the narrow ledge and immediately began setting up the anchor point for their improvised rescue system. The pitons drove into cracks in the rock face with soft metallic sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Maria knew that any significant noise could alert the Taliban fighters to their presence and location. "Anchor point secure," she whispered into her radio. "Send up the rope for Rodriguez." Williams had rigged a makeshift harness around the unconscious SEAL using climbing gear and equipment straps. It wasn't pretty, but it would distribute Rodriguez's weight safely during the vertical haul up the rock face. Martinez and Thompson took positions to guide the wounded man during his ascent, preventing him from banging into the stone.